When struggling cowboy Caleb Morrison discovers a little girl tied to railway tracks with a cruel sign declaring her not worth saving, he faces an impossible choice that will determine not only her fate, but his own. Can a man who's lost faith in his own value find the courage to prove that every life, including his own, is worth fighting for? A gunshot cracked across the empty Montana Territory plains, sending prairie dogs diving into their holes. As Caleb Morrison's horse reared up in surprise, the echo bounced off distant mountains like a warning bell. But Caleb barely flinched. In 1879, gunshots were as common as morning coffee in this wild land where dreams came to die. He patted his Mustang's neck and squinted toward the source of the noise. 3 riders sat on a ridge about a mile away, their black shapes cutting against the orange sunrise like vultures waiting for something to die. They seemed to be watching him, though he couldn't figure out why. Caleb Morrison wasn't important enough for anyone to notice, let alone follow. The cool morning air bit at his cheeks as he urged his horse forward along the railway tracks that stretched like a steel river toward the next town. His stomach felt empty as a ghost town, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning when Mrs. Henderson at the boarding house had taken pity on him and shared her breakfast biscuits. "Come on, Buck," he whispered to his horse, using the name he'd given the animal back when he still believed in luck. Maybe Copper Creek will be different. But even as he said it, Caleb knew better. Towns were all the same for men like him, men who carried failure like a heavy coat they couldn't take off. He'd been turned away from 6 ranches in the past month alone. Too unreliable, they always said. Can't trust a man who lost 3 herds of cattle. The truth hurt worse than the lies. Caleb had lost those cattle. Each hurt a nail in the coffin of his reputation. The first stampede happened during a lightning storm when he was just 19 and thought he knew everything. The second came from his own carelessness. He'd left a gate open after a long night of drinking. The third time, rustlers had stolen 40 head, while Caleb slept off a fever, too sick to stand guard. Now, at 35, he felt older than the mountains. His clothes hung loose on his thin frame, and his once proud mustache had grown scraggly from poor eating and worse sleeping. The pocket watch his father had given him, the only valuable thing he owned, ticked against his chest like a countdown to nowhere. The railway tracks hummed beneath Buck's hooves, a sound that always reminded Caleb of a giant tuning fork. He'd heard tell that trains could travel faster than the fastest horse, carrying people and goods across hundreds of miles in just days. Progress, they called it. But for men like him, progress meant getting left behind. A hawk circled overhead, riding the warm air currents that rose from the sun-baked earth. Caleb envied that bird. Hawks never worried about their next meal or where they'd sleep. They just flew and hunted and lived free as the wind itself. Buck's ears twitched forward suddenly, and Caleb noticed his horse was staring at something down the track. Following the animal's gaze, Caleb saw movement in the distance too far to make out clearly, but definitely something that didn't belong on empty railway tracks. "What you see, boy?" Caleb asked, leaning forward in his saddle. The wind shifted, bringing with it the smell of sagebrush and something else he couldn't place. Fear, maybe, or desperation. Both scents Caleb knew well from his own long experience with both emotions. His father's pocket watch ticked steadily against his ribs, marking time that seemed to stretch like taffy in the morning heat. Each second felt important somehow, as if the world was holding its breath for something big to happen. The 3 riders he'd spotted earlier had vanished completely now, but their presence lingered in his mind like smoke from a dead campfire. In his experience, when men watched you from a distance, they usually had plans that didn't include your happiness. Buck whinnied softly and tossed his head, eager to investigate whatever had caught his attention down the tracks. Caleb had learned to trust his horse's instincts over the years. Animals could sense things humans missed: danger, weather changes, sometimes even death itself. "All right, Buck," Caleb said, touching his heels to the horse's flanks. "Let's see what's got you so interested." As they moved forward, the sun climbed higher into the Montana sky, burning off the morning mist that clung to the prairie grass like sleepy ghosts. Somewhere behind them, Copper Creek was waking up, people starting their day with coffee and hope, while Caleb rode toward whatever waited on the tracks ahead. His stomach growled again, reminding him that hope didn't fill empty bellies. But for the first time in months, Caleb Morrison felt like he was riding toward something instead of running away from it. The pocket watch ticked on, counting down moments to a meeting that would change everything. Something glinted in the morning sunlight ahead, metal reflecting like a mirror signal across the empty prairie. Caleb shaded his eyes with his hand, trying to make sense of what he was seeing on the railway tracks about half a mile in front of him. As he rode closer, the shape became clearer, and his heart nearly stopped beating. A small figure sat motionless on the steel rails, and beside it stood a wooden sign that caught the light with each gust of wind. Caleb spurred Buck into a gallop, his mind racing faster than his horse's hooves. "Please let me be wrong," he whispered to himself, but as the distance closed, his worst fears took shape before his eyes. A little girl, no older than 6, sat tied to the railway tracks with thick rope that bound her hands behind her back. Her brown hair hung in messy tangles around a dirt-streaked face, and her simple cotton dress was torn at the hem. But it was the wooden sign planted next to her that made Caleb's blood turn cold as Winter Creek water. "Not worth saving," it declared in letters painted black as a funeral shroud. Caleb threw himself from his saddle before Buck had even stopped moving. The girl looked up at him with eyes the color of storm clouds, wide with terror but somehow resigned, as if she'd been preparing for this moment her whole short life. "Easy now, little one," Caleb said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "I'm here to help." The child didn't answer at first, just watched him with those enormous eyes as he dropped to his knees beside the tracks. His hands shook as he examined the ropes that bound her wrists. Whoever had tied these knots knew their business. They were tight enough to hurt, but not tight enough to cut off blood flow completely. Someone had wanted her to suffer while she waited. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Caleb asked, trying to keep his voice calm while fury burned in his chest like a forge fire. "Lucy," she whispered so quietly he almost missed it. "Lucy May Patterson." The surname hit Caleb like a punch to the gut. He knew that name, knew the reputation that went with it. Buck Patterson was a mean drunk who'd been kicked out of 3 towns for fighting and causing trouble. Caleb had seen him in saloons across the territory, always loud, always angry, always looking for someone weaker to push around. "Patterson's your daddy?" Caleb asked, though he already knew the answer from the fear in her eyes. Lucy nodded, fresh tears starting to track through the dirt on her cheeks. "He said I eat too much food and cost too much money. Said nobody would want a girl like me anyway. So he might as well put me where the train could solve his problem." Caleb's jaw muscles worked as he struggled with the knots. The rope was new, probably bought special for this terrible purpose. The thought made him sick to his stomach. What kind of man bought rope specifically to tie his own child to railway tracks? "My mama died last winter from the fever," Lucy continued, her voice getting smaller with each word. "Daddy said it was my fault because I got sick first and gave it to her. He said everything I touch turns bad." "That's a lie," Caleb said firmly, surprised by how strong his own voice sounded. "Sometimes bad things happen, but that doesn't make them your fault." Lucy studied his face carefully, like she was trying to decide whether to trust him. "You don't even know me, mister. How can you be sure I'm not bad luck?" It was a fair question from someone so young, and it cut straight to Caleb's heart. Here was a 6-year-old child asking the same question he'd been asking himself for years, whether he was worth anything or just a walking disaster. "Because," he said, working his fingernails under a particularly stubborn knot, "I've met plenty of bad people in my time, and none of them ever worried about whether they were good or bad. The fact that you're asking means you got a good heart." A train whistle sounded in the distance, still far off but definitely getting closer. The sound sent ice water through Caleb's veins as he calculated the time. The morning freight train always passed through this section around 10 o'clock, and by the position of the sun, they had maybe 30 minutes before it arrived. "How long have you been sitting here?" he asked, trying to keep the worry out of his voice. "Since before the stars went away," Lucy said. "Daddy and his friends brought me here when it was still dark. They said the train would be quick and then nobody would have to think about me anymore." The casual way she repeated her father's cruel words made Caleb's hands clench into fists. He forced himself to breathe slowly and focus on the ropes. Getting angry wouldn't help Lucy, but getting her free would. "Well, they were wrong about that," Caleb said, finally loosening the rope around her left wrist. "Because I'm thinking about you right now, and I plan to keep thinking about you for a long time to come." Lucy's eyes widened with something that might have been hope. "Really? You're not going to leave me here?" "Not a chance," Caleb promised, working on the final knot. A man who leaves a child in danger isn't much of a man at all. The rope fell away from her wrists, leaving angry red marks where it had rubbed against her skin. Caleb gently helped her stand, noticing how she wobbled on legs that had been sitting still too long. Her bare feet were cut and dirty, and he realized she'd been brought here without shoes. "Can you walk?" he asked. Lucy took a few shaky steps, wincing as her feet touched the sharp rocks between the railway ties. "I think so, but my feet hurt something awful." Caleb scooped her up without hesitation, carrying her toward where Buck waited patiently. As he lifted her onto the horse's back, he noticed how light she felt, too light for a healthy 6-year-old. When was the last time this child had eaten a proper meal? "Hold on tight," he told her, swinging up into the saddle behind her. The train whistle blew again, much closer now, and Caleb could feel the rumble of the approaching engine through the ground beneath Buck's hooves. They had maybe 15 minutes before the iron beast thundered through this spot, but they were clear of the tracks now, and that was what mattered most. As they rode away from the railway, Lucy leaned back against Caleb's chest and asked quietly, "Mr. What's your name?" "Caleb Morrison," he said. "And I'm mighty pleased to meet you, Lucy May Patterson." "Are you going to keep me?" she asked with the heartbreaking directness that only children possess. The question hit Caleb harder than any punch he'd ever taken. Here was a little girl who'd been abandoned by the one person who should have protected her, asking a stranger if he might want her around. The trust in her voice was both beautiful and terrible. "If you'll have me," he said softly. "But I should warn you, I'm not much of a provider. Been failing at most everything for longer than I care to remember." Lucy turned in the saddle to look at him directly. "Maybe we can figure out how to be worth something together." The simple wisdom of her words hit Caleb like lightning. Maybe being worth saving wasn't something you earned or lost like money. Maybe it was something you discovered when you finally found someone else worth saving too. "Mister, you gotta run away now," Lucy cried out, her small voice cracking with panic as she heard the train whistle growing louder. The iron beast was getting closer, and she could feel the railroad tracks starting to shake beneath her. Caleb's weathered hands worked frantically at the ropes. The knots were tight and cruel, tied by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Each twist of rope seemed to mock his shaking fingers as precious seconds ticked away. "What's your name, child?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm even as sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Lucy May Patterson," she whispered, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. "My mama died when the sickness came through town last winter. The doctor said it was lung fever, and she coughed up blood for 3 whole weeks before she went to heaven." The first rope came loose, and Caleb felt his heart leap with hope. But there were still 3 more binding her to the cold iron rails. His fingers moved to the second knot, thick and stubborn as a mule. "My daddy brought me out here this morning," Lucy continued, her voice small and broken. "He said I was eating too much food and costing too much money. He said nobody in town wanted to take care of a useless little girl who couldn't do any real work." Something dark and angry twisted in Caleb's chest as he worked at the rope. He'd known hunger himself, had felt the sharp ache of empty bellies and empty pockets. But to do this to a child, to your own child, was beyond his understanding. "He tied me up real tight and put up that sign," Lucy said, nodding toward the wooden board that stood like a gravestone beside the tracks. "He said the train would solve his problem, and then he could move to California like he always wanted." The second rope fell away. 2 more to go, and the train whistle was getting closer now. Caleb could almost feel the vibration in the rails beneath his knees. "My daddy ain't always been mean," Lucy said quietly, as if she needed to defend the man who had left her to die. "Before Mama got sick, he used to tell me stories about cowboys and Indians. He taught me how to whistle like a meadowlark and how to find the North Star on clear nights." Caleb's hands paused for just a moment. He understood that kind of love, the kind that got twisted up with pain and desperation until you couldn't tell the difference between caring and hurting. His own father had been that way, loving him and leaving him in equal measure. "People do terrible things when they're scared and hurting," Caleb said softly, returning to his work on the third rope. "But that don't make it right, and it sure don't make you worth less than any other person walking God's green earth." The third rope snapped free, and Lucy's legs were finally loose. But the fourth rope, the one around her waist, was the thickest and most stubborn of all. The train whistle blew again, much closer now, and Caleb could see the black smoke on the horizon. "Why are you helping me, mister?" Lucy asked, her gray eyes wide and serious. "You don't even know me. Maybe my daddy was right. Maybe I ain't worth the trouble." Caleb stopped working at the rope and looked directly into her eyes. In them, he saw something he recognized, the same defeated look he'd been carrying around like a heavy pack for years, the same voice that whispered worthless and unwanted and better off gone. "You want to know something, Lucy May?" he said, his voice growing stronger. "I've been carrying around my own invisible sign for longer than I care to admit. Mine said things like, 'failed cowboy,' and 'can't do nothing right,' and 'waste of space.' But looking at you right now, tied up and scared, but still brave enough to worry about a stranger, I'm thinking maybe both our signs got the words all wrong." The fourth rope was fighting him, but Caleb could feel it starting to give way. The train was close enough now that they could hear the chug-chug-chug of the engine, mixing with the thunder overhead. "My mama used to say that God don't make no mistakes," Lucy said softly. "She said every person has something special inside them, even when they can't see it themselves." "Your mama sounds like she was a wise woman," Caleb replied, giving the rope a final, desperate tug. It snapped apart just as the train came into view around the bend, black smoke billowing from its stack like a dragon breathing fire. Caleb scooped Lucy up in his arms and ran toward his horse, who was dancing nervously at the edge of the rocks. Behind them, the train whistle screamed its warning as the engineer spotted something on the tracks ahead, the wooden sign that still stood beside the rails, proclaiming its cruel message to the empty air. As they climbed onto the horse and rode away from the tracks, Lucy wrapped her thin arms around Caleb's waist and held on tight. For the first time in months, neither of them felt alone in the world. But their relief was short-lived. As they crested the small hill beyond the rocks, Caleb spotted something that made his blood run cold. 3 riders in the distance, heading straight for them at full gallop. Buck Patterson had returned, and he'd brought friends. "There!" Buck Patterson's voice carried across the grassland like the cry of a hunting wolf. "That's the fool who stole my property!" Caleb's horse stumbled slightly as they rode hard across the uneven ground, and Lucy's grip tightened around his waist. Behind them, the 3 riders were gaining fast, their horses fresh, while Caleb's mount had been traveling since dawn. "Who are those other men with your daddy?" Caleb called over his shoulder as they raced toward a line of cottonwood trees that marked the course of a small creek. "The tall one with the black hat is Jake Murdoch," Lucy replied, her voice tight with fear. "He runs the card games at the saloon in town. The other one is his brother Pete. They're mean men who hurt people for money." Caleb's mind raced as fast as his horse's hooves. The Murdoch brothers were known throughout the territory as hired guns who solved problems with bullets. If Patterson had brought them along, this wasn't just about getting Lucy back. This was about making sure no witnesses lived to tell the tale. They reached the creek bed just as the first rifle shot cracked through the air. The bullet whined past Caleb's ear, close enough that he could feel the heat of it. His horse splashed through the shallow water and scrambled up the far bank, but the pursuers were gaining ground. "Why won't they just leave us alone?" Lucy cried, pressing her face against Caleb's back. "Because some folks can't stand to see other people be free when they ain't," Caleb replied grimly. "And because your daddy's pride got hurt when you got away." Another shot rang out, this one splintering the bark of a cottonwood tree just inches from where they passed. Caleb could hear the thunder of hooves getting closer, could almost feel the breath of the pursuing horses on the back of his neck. "I know a place we can hide," Lucy said suddenly. "There's an old mining camp about a mile up this creek. Mama and me used to pick berries there before she got sick. It's got caves and tunnels, where the miners used to dig for silver." Caleb yanked on the reins, turning his horse upstream along the rocky creek bed. The water would help hide their tracks, but it also slowed them down. Behind them, he could hear Patterson shouting orders to his hired guns. "There's a narrow canyon up ahead," Lucy continued, pointing with one small hand while keeping the other locked around Caleb's belt. "If we can get there first, maybe we can find a place where they can't follow." The abandoned mining camp appeared like a ghost town among the rocks and scrub pine. Weather-beaten buildings sagged under the weight of neglect, and rusted equipment lay scattered around like the bones of some ancient beast. Most importantly, the canyon walls rose up on both sides, dotted with dark cave openings where desperate miners had once chased dreams of silver and gold. Caleb guided his horse behind the ruins of what had once been the main office building and quickly dismounted. Lucy slid down beside him, her face pale but determined. "Which way to the caves?" he asked, checking his rifle to make sure it was loaded. "Up there." Lucy pointed to a narrow path that zigzagged up the canyon wall. "There's a big cave about halfway up that goes way back into the mountain. Mama said it was deep enough to hide a whole family if trouble came calling." They could hear their pursuers entering the lower end of the canyon now, their horses' hooves clattering on the rocky ground. Patterson's angry voice echoed off the stone walls as he ordered his men to spread out and search every building. "You take care of that horse," Caleb told Lucy, handing her the reins. "Keep him quiet and calm. I'm going to find us a way up to those caves that won't leave tracks they can follow." As Lucy led the horse into the shadows behind the old assay office, Caleb studied the canyon walls with new eyes. The miners had carved handholds and footholds into the rock face in several places, creating paths that would be invisible to anyone who didn't know what to look for. "Lucy May Patterson." Buck Patterson's voice boomed through the camp below. "I know you're here somewhere, girl. You come out now, and I might just make your punishment quick." Lucy shivered at her father's words, but she didn't cry. Instead, she looked up at Caleb with eyes that held more courage than most grown men he'd known. "He's lying," she whispered. "He's always lying when he gets that tone in his voice. He means to hurt us both." Caleb nodded grimly. He'd heard that same false kindness before, usually right before the real cruelty began. But this time would be different. This time, he had something worth fighting for. "Come on," he said, taking Lucy's hand in his own. "Let's find that cave your mama told you about." "And Lucy?" "Yes, Seer? Whatever happens up there, you remember what I told you about being worth saving. No matter what anybody else says, you remember that." Jake Murdoch's harsh laughter echoed off the canyon walls as the three men began their systematic search of the abandoned buildings. Time was running short, and the afternoon sun was already casting long shadows across the rocky ground. But high above them, following an ancient miner's path that only a local child would know, two unlikely companions climbed toward safety and whatever destiny awaited them in the darkness of the mountain's heart. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the rocky canyon as Caleb's boot connected with a dead branch, snapping it clean in half. Behind the massive red stones, Lucy pressed herself against the cold rock face, her small fingers clutching the raggedy doll she'd managed to save from the tracks. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Caleb could make out three distinct horses now, their breathing heavy, their riders pushing them hard through the afternoon heat. "Caleb Morrison." Buck Patterson's voice boomed across the wasteland, sharp and angry like a rattlesnake's warning. "I know you're hiding in them rocks. You got my property, and I want her back." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs as he checked his old Colt revolver. 5 bullets remained not enough if things went bad. He'd never been much of a gunfighter, more likely to talk his way out of trouble than shoot his way clear. But today felt different. Today, someone was counting on him. "She ain't property, Buck," Caleb called back, stepping into view but keeping the rocks between him and the riders. "She's your own flesh and blood." Patterson urged his black stallion closer, close enough that Caleb could see the ugly sneer twisting his weathered face. The man looked like he hadn't bathed in weeks, his clothes stained with whiskey, and worse things. Behind him rode 2 companions, one tall and thin like a fence post, the other short and wide with arms thick as tree trunk. "Flesh and blood costs money to keep alive," Patterson snarled. "And that girl's done nothing but eat my food and waste my time since her mama died. I got debts to pay and mouths to feed that actually matter." Lucy peeked around the edge of the rock, her storm-gray eyes filling with tears. "Daddy, please," she whispered, though her voice barely carried on the wind. "I promise I'll be good. I promise I won't cry anymore." The thin man laughed, a sound like crows cawing. "Look at that, Buck. Even the kid knows she ain't worth the trouble." Caleb felt something hot and dangerous rise in his chest. He'd heard those same words about himself from ranch bosses and townfolk for years, but hearing them said about Lucy made his blood boil. "The only thing not worth saving here is your black heart, Patterson." The storm clouds that had been building all day chose that moment to block out the sun completely, casting the canyon in shadow. Lightning flickered in the distance, still miles away but moving closer. The horses stamped nervously, sensing the electricity in the air. Patterson's hand moved to his gun. "You always were too soft, Morrison. That's why no one will hire you. That's why you sleep in barns and beg for scraps like a mangy dog. Each word hit Caleb like a physical blow because they held enough truth to sting. He had been sleeping rough, had been turned away from job after job, but looking at Lucy's frightened face, he realized something important. Maybe being soft wasn't the weakness everyone said it was. Maybe it was the only thing that mattered. "You're right about one thing, Buck," Caleb said, his voice growing steady and strong. "I have been soft. Soft enough to see that little girl as a human being instead of a burden. Soft enough to know that some things are worth fighting for, even if you ain't much of a fighter." The wide man with the thick arms shifted in his saddle. "Buck, maybe we should just leave it. There's easier ways to solve your problem." "No," Patterson snapped, his eyes never leaving Caleb. "This drifter's made it personal now, and I don't let personal insults go unanswered." Thunder rumbled closer, and the first real drops of rain began to fall, fat and warm against Caleb's face. Lucy stepped out from her hiding place, moving to stand beside him despite her fear. Her small hand slipped into his calloused one, and Caleb felt a strength he'd never known before, flowing through that simple touch. "I ain't going back to the tracks, Daddy," Lucy said, her voice small but determined. "And Caleb ain't gonna let you make me." Patterson's face turned red with rage. "We'll see about that, you ungrateful little—" "Choose your next words real careful, Buck," Caleb interrupted, his gun hand steady despite the tremor in his voice. "Because they might be your last." The canyon fell silent, except for the increasing patter of raindrops on stone and the nervous snorting of the horses. 4 men and 1 little girl stood frozen in a moment that would change everything, while overhead the storm gathered its full fury and prepared to break upon the Montana territory with all the violence of nature unleashed. Lucy's scream pierced the air like a knife as the first gunshot echoed off the canyon walls. Caleb dove sideways, pulling the little girl behind a fallen log as Patterson's bullet whined past his ear. So close he could feel the heat of it. The storm chose that exact moment to unleash its fury, sending torrents of rain cascading down the rocky slopes and turning the dusty ground into a treacherous maze of mud and stone. "Stay down!" Caleb shouted to Lucy, but she was already pressed flat against the earth, her doll clutched tight against her chest. Water poured off the rocks above them, like a dozen tiny waterfalls, and within seconds they were both soaked to the skin. The thin man had circled around to the left, his rifle glinting despite the gray light. Caleb could hear him cursing as he struggled to keep his powder dry in the sudden downpour. That gave them a few precious seconds, but not many. "You picked the wrong day to play hero, Morrison," Patterson bellowed from somewhere in the maze of boulders. Lightning crashed overhead, so close it made the very air buzz with electricity, and for one brilliant moment the entire canyon was lit up white as noon. In that flash, Caleb saw everything. Patterson crouched behind his horse, the thin man taking aim from behind a scrub pine, and the thick-armed rider moving to block their only escape route back toward the main trail. They were surrounded, outgunned, and running out of time. "Lucy," Caleb whispered, rain streaming down his face. "I need you to be the bravest girl in all of Montana territory for just a few more minutes. Can you do that for me?" She nodded, water dripping from her tangled hair, and Caleb saw something in her eyes that reminded him of her mother, a fierce determination that no amount of hardship could break. "What do you need me to do?" "When I count to 3, you run toward that big rock over there, the one that looks like a sleeping bear. You get behind it and you stay put until I come get you. Don't matter what you hear. Don't matter what happens. You stay hidden. Understand?" Thunder crashed again, closer this time, and the rain came down so hard it was like standing under a waterfall. The thick-armed man was shouting something to Patterson, but the storm swallowed his words. "1," Caleb whispered, checking his gun one more time. 5 shots, 3 men. Not good odds, but he'd faced worse things than bad odds lately. A rifle cracked from the left, the bullet smacking into the log above their heads and sending splinters flying. The thin man had found his range despite the rain. 2, Caleb said, and Lucy gathered herself like a cat ready to pounce. Patterson's voice cut through the storm again. "Morrison, last chance. Send out the girl and maybe I'll let you ride away." Caleb looked down at Lucy one more time. In her eyes, he saw not just trust but something else, faith. Faith that he wouldn't let her down. Faith that he was the kind of man worth believing in. It was a responsibility he'd never asked for, but one he realized he'd been preparing for his whole life. 3. Lucy sprinted across the open ground like a rabbit fleeing a hawk, her bare feet splashing through puddles as she zigzagged between the rocks. The thin man swung his rifle toward her, but Caleb was already moving, his first shot taking the would-be killer high in the shoulder and spinning him around like a child's top. The thick-armed man charged on horseback, his own pistol blazing. But the storm had turned the ground treacherous. His horse slipped on the wet rocks, throwing him clear, and he landed hard against a boulder with a sickening thud that left him still and silent. That left only Patterson. "You made this personal, Morrison," the man screamed over the howling wind. Lightning struck somewhere close by, close enough to make their ears ring and their hair stand on end. She was never worth saving anyway. Look at her, dirty, worthless, nothing but trouble. Caleb stepped out from cover, rain plastering his shirt to his body, his gun steady in his hand. "You're wrong, Buck. She's worth more than you'll ever understand." Patterson raised his own weapon, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, the two men faced each other across 20 feet of storm-lashed ground. Behind the bear-shaped rock, Lucy watched with wide eyes, her hands pressed over her mouth to keep from crying out. "The difference between you and me," Caleb said, his voice somehow carrying clearly despite the storm, "is that I finally found something worth dying for. You never found anything worth living for." The lightning that split the sky in that instant was so bright it turned the world white as fresh snow. And in its aftermath, the thunder that followed shook the very ground beneath their feet. But louder than the thunder was the sound of a single gunshot, echoing off the canyon walls like a final judgment. When the light faded and their vision cleared, Buck Patterson lay motionless in the mud, his gun unfired beside him. Caleb stood swaying on his feet, smoke rising from the barrel of his Colt despite the pouring rain. Lucy ran to him then, splashing through puddles and scrambling over rocks, throwing her small arms around his waist as he holstered his weapon with trembling hands. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice muffled against his wet shirt. "Are we safe now?" Caleb looked down at the man who had tried to throw away his own daughter like unwanted trash, then up at the storm that was already beginning to move on toward the eastern horizon. The rain was gentler now, washing the canyon clean, and somewhere in the distance a meadowlark sang its liquid song. "Yes, little darling," he said, lifting Lucy into his arms. "We're safe, and we're going home." But as they walked toward their waiting horse, neither of them noticed the thin man stirring behind his boulder, his good arm reaching slowly for his fallen rifle, his eyes burning with the promise of revenge. "Sheriff's coming back with more men." The urgent shout from the blacksmith's apprentice sent the entire town of Willow Springs into a frenzy. 3 weeks had passed since Caleb and Lucy arrived at what seemed like a peaceful settlement, but now their safe haven was cracking apart like an eggshell. Mrs. Helena Cartwright grabbed Caleb's arm as he carried feed sacks into her general store. "Samuel Briggs rode in this morning asking questions about you and the child. Says there's a reward posted for information about a kidnapper and a missing girl." Caleb's heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. He'd known this day might come, but hearing it spoken aloud made his worst fears feel real. "What kind of reward?" $50, Helena whispered. "That's more money than most folks here see in half a year." Through the store window, Caleb watched Lucy playing hopscotch with the other children in the dusty Main Street. She wore a new blue dress that Helena had sewn for her, and her laughter rang out like church bells on Sunday morning. For 3 weeks, she'd been safe, fed, and surrounded by people who treated her with kindness. Now that life hung by a thread, "There's something else," Helena continued, her voice heavy with worry. "Briggs wasn't alone. He had 2 federal marshals with him, and they're asking to see official papers for any new residents." Caleb's stomach twisted. He had no legal claim to Lucy, no adoption papers, no proof that he was anything more than what Buck Patterson's lies painted him as, a kidnapper who'd stolen another man's child. The truth about the railway tracks and the cruel sign seemed impossible to prove now that Patterson was dead and buried. "How long do we have?" he asked. "Maybe until sunset. They're checking the saloons and boarding houses first, working their way through town." Outside, Lucy spotted Caleb through the window and waved cheerfully, completely unaware that her newfound happiness was about to shatter. The sight of her innocent joy made Caleb's chest ache with a fierce protectiveness he'd never felt before. Thomas Cartwright, Helena's husband, emerged from the back room carrying a leather satchel. "Been thinking about your situation," he said quietly. There might be another way. He opened the satchel to reveal a collection of official-looking documents. I keep the records for folks passing through on the railway. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, death notices, all the papers that follow people from place to place. Caleb stared at the documents, hope flickering in his chest like a candle in the wind. What are you suggesting? Helena and I never had children of our own, Thomas explained. But we've always wanted a family. If we were to officially adopt Lucy, and if you were to become our business partner and her guardian. He left the sentence hanging, but the meaning was clear. You'd do that? Risk everything for strangers? Helena stepped forward, her eyes soft with understanding. Caleb, we've watched you these past weeks. The way you read to Lucy every night, how you taught her to ride, the patience you show when she has nightmares about her father. You're not a kidnapper, you're the answer to our prayers for family. Before Caleb could respond, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Sheriff Briggs had finished his search of the saloons and was heading their way. The decision point had arrived faster than any of them expected. There's a back door, Thomas said urgently. Take Lucy and ride hard for the river crossing. We'll buy you time, but you need to disappear until we can sort out the legal papers. Caleb looked through the window at Lucy, still playing with the other children, blissfully unaware of the danger closing in. Everything in him rebelled against the idea of running again, of taking her back into uncertainty and fear. But what choice did he have? Wait, Helena said, pressing something into his hand. Lucy will need this. It was a small wooden horse, carved with loving detail. Lucy had admired it in the store window every day since their arrival, but Caleb had never had the money to buy it for her. Promise me something, Helena whispered as the sound of horses grew louder. Promise me you'll come back when it's safe. This family isn't complete without both of you. Caleb nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging his throat. He tucked the wooden horse into his jacket pocket and headed for the back door, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether Lucy would grow up free or find herself tied to those railway tracks once again. As he slipped out into the alley behind the store, he could hear Sheriff Briggs calling out questions to the townspeople. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and this time, there would be nowhere left to run. The storm clouds overhead seemed to mirror the darkness gathering around them, but somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled with what sounded almost like hope. The wooden horse felt warm in Lucy's small hands as she clutched it against her chest, hiding beneath a pile of freight blankets in the back of Thomas Cartwright's wagon. 2 months had passed since that terrifying day when they'd fled Willow Springs. And now, they were finally coming home. Are the bad men really gone forever? Lucy whispered to Caleb, who sat beside her in the darkness of their hiding place. Forever and always, Caleb assured her, though his own heart still raced with the memory of their narrow escape. The legal papers tucked safely in his jacket pocket told a different story now. One where Helena and Thomas Cartwright had officially adopted Lucy, and where Caleb Morrison was listed as her legal guardian and partner in the family freight business. Judge Margaret Sullivan in the territorial capital had been surprisingly understanding when presented with the evidence of Buck Patterson's cruelty. The torn ropes, the weathered sign, and the testimony of 3 witnesses who'd seen Patterson threaten the child had been enough to clear Caleb of all charges. More importantly, Patterson's criminal associates had been arrested trying to sell stolen cattle, ending any threat of future revenge. As the wagon rolled into Willow Springs, Lucy peeked out from under the blankets and gasped with delight. The entire town had turned out to welcome them home. Colorful ribbons hung from every porch, and someone had painted a new sign over the general store that read, Cartwright Family Freight, all lives have value. Surprise! The crowd shouted, as Thomas brought the wagon to a stop in front of the store. Children ran forward to greet Lucy, while the adults gathered around Caleb with genuine smiles and warm handshakes. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, the town's physician, stepped forward with official-looking papers in her hands. These came in on yesterday's train, she announced. Legal adoption documents from the territorial court, properly signed and sealed. Helena Cartwright rushed forward, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pulled Lucy into her arms. Welcome home, our darling daughter, she whispered, and Lucy hugged her back with fierce happiness. But it was what happened next that surprised everyone, including Caleb himself. Old Pete Murphy, the town's former sheriff who'd lost his job due to drinking, approached with his hat in his hands. Morrison, Pete said, his voice rough with emotion. Heard what you did for the little one. Been thinking about it while you were gone. If a man like you can turn his life around, maybe there's hope for an old fool like me too. Caleb studied Pete's weathered face, seeing his own former desperation reflected in the older man's eyes. What are you asking, Pete? Asking if you might need a hand with the freight business. I know horses, I know the trails, and I'm tired of drowning my worth in whiskey bottles. The request caught Caleb completely off guard. Here was a man seeking the same second chance that Caleb had been given. And suddenly he understood something profound about how kindness spreads from person to person like ripples in a pond. Can you start Monday? Caleb asked, extending his hand. Pete's face lit up with the first real smile anyone in Willow Springs had seen from him in years. Yes, sir. I surely can. As the celebration continued around them, Lucy tugged on Caleb's sleeve. Papa Caleb, she said, using the name that had become natural to both of them. Look what I made. She handed him a small piece of wood she'd been carving during their journey. It was rough and simple, clearly the work of small hands, but the words burned into it were perfectly clear. Worth saving. I made it for you, she explained, because you saved me first, which means you were already worth saving all along. You just forgot for a while. Caleb knelt down and pulled her close, overwhelmed by the simple truth of her words. Around them, the people of Willow Springs continued their celebration, but all he could focus on was this remarkable little girl who'd taught him that worth wasn't something you earned through success or lost through failure. It was something you carried inside yourself, waiting to be rediscovered in moments of courage and love. As the evening stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Caleb looked up at the railway tracks that ran alongside the town. Once, those iron rails had nearly been the site of unthinkable tragedy. Now they represented something entirely different, the path that had led two lost souls toward home, family, and the understanding that no one, absolutely no one, is ever truly beyond saving. The wooden sign Lucy had carved would hang above their front door for years to come, a daily reminder that worth isn't measured by what society thinks of you, but by the love you're willing to give and receive. And sometimes, the very act of saving someone else becomes the moment you discover you were worth saving all along.